I don't know if we realize this or not, but the book of Genesis is really a radical book for its time. It's not a scientific book, as some people might like to think it is, but it's a book that contains stories that at the time it was written were truly revolutionary and radical. Maybe not so much for us today, but they were at the time it was written. And why is that? Because the book of Genesis has two things that it focuses on intensely. First, that people, human beings, are made in the image of God. This seems like a simple concept to us, but in the time of the book of Genesis, that was pretty radical. Because in those times, gods, there were many gods, and all the civilizations believed in many different gods, and those gods were not always kind and nice. In fact, they were much like human beings. They were petty, vindictive, mean, and nasty. Some gods were good gods that took care of people and watched over them, but many of the gods had very serious personal and deep flaws. And that was the way the world explained how good and evil could exist side by side. It wasn't until the book of Genesis and Abraham that all of a sudden there came this concept that there was one supreme God, and that God had made the world out of love and in goodness, and that God desired love and goodness for his creation. That was truly a radical idea. Not that there was just one God, but that God actually cared about his creation. Human beings are not the playthings of gods. Human beings were also not made to be alone, according to the book of Genesis. They were to be in relationship with each other and with God. Again, that is an extremely radical position to hold in the time of Abraham. Because in the time of Abraham, the gods just used human beings as their playthings, things to be used and tossed aside, but not the God of Abraham. The God of Abraham wanted to be in relationship with his creation, with human beings. How are human beings made in the image of God? Not that God looks like any individual person, but that we are the ultimate crescendo of God's creation. We are the final result of perfection in God's creation. We are the evolution of what God intended creation to be, human beings. His desire for us to be with him for all eternity. So the book of Genesis is not just quaint stories telling us how God loves us. It's a radical departure from the philosophies of the world at its time. And it should still be radical for us today. That God loves each and every one of you, made you special and wonderful in his eyes. Every human being, not just those of us gathered here, but every single human being is made wonderful in the eyes of God. That is truly a radical thought, and one that we must continue to remember as we live our lives. But it doesn't stop there, because Jesus is even more of a radical in his time. Now, there are many reasons why Jesus was crucified, but one of the reasons Jesus was persecuted and ultimately crucified was because of his radical treatment of people that were considered less than important. Remember, in the time of Jesus in the Roman Empire, and in other empires as well, women were little more than property. And yet Jesus travels with them. He speaks to them. They sit with him at table. That would have been unheard of in the time of Jesus. He is a radical. He sees every human being as important, not as property. And so when Jesus in the gospel today talks about Moses allowing people to set a woman aside, it's because they couldn't quite grasp the concept that God was trying to deliver them. Jesus refuses to accept that. Jesus says no one should be treated as less than the others, that we are all created beautifully and wonderfully, equal, made to be complementary to each other, different but complementary, that all of us are special. And that radicalism was rejected, and so Jesus suffered for that. Jesus proposes a fidelity and equality that certainly was not in line with his times. Our relationship with each other is meant by God to lead us into a relationship with God. The relationships that we have with each other are just a sign, a symbol of the relationship we're supposed to be in with God. Love of neighbor flows from love of God. Love of God flows to love of neighbor. Each are complementary. We cannot say we love God and hate our neighbor. We cannot love our neighbor without first having had that love from God. All love leads to God. To be a human being is to be in relationship not only with God, but with each other. No one is meant to be an island. We are all meant to be a part of a community of believers, a nation, a people. We are all meant to live together in harmony and love. That is the desire that God has for his creation. And of course, this has huge implications for Christian life. Jesus is proof that our relationship with God cannot be completely broken. No matter where you are in the world, no matter who you are, your relationship with God can never truly be severed. It can be damaged by sin, it can be hurt, but it can never ultimately, completely be broken. That is the life of Jesus Christ. That is the message he came to deliver when he died on the cross, that he would never allow us to be fully separated from God. Our challenge is to know and love God as a father and one another as brothers and sisters. And we can see this in our second reading from the letter to the Hebrews. God is calling us into a sacred kinship. We are all meant to be in a holy relationship with God and with each other. If God is our Father, and he is the Father of all, then we are all meant to be brothers and sisters. So how do we develop healthy relationships? Well, I think that can be summed up rather quickly, hopefully quickly, in 3 words: please, thanks, and sorry. When we need something, it's always too good to ask, saying please. If we say please, and we are conscious of how we are asking for things, we are more likely to have a better relationship. Thanks. Do we have gratitude, true gratitude, for the gifts that God has poured out on us and the people in our lives? Do we say thank you enough to the people in our lives? Not maybe for something they did, but just for being who they are, for being with us. Can we be thankful and grateful each and every day for the blessings God has poured out upon us? Can we say sorry? One of the most difficult things for human beings to do is to acknowledge their brokenness, to acknowledge that sometimes we are actually wrong. That is difficult for all of us to do, but it's important to have healthy relationships, to acknowledge that there are times when we might not always be in the right. In the end, our relationships here on earth are meant to lead us to the one true relationship with God. We believe from the book of Genesis through the book of Revelation that God has made his creation to be with him, that he made us out of love, in love, and for love. We all come from him, and ultimately his desire is for all of us to return to him. God's desire is not just to be one with each of you, but for all of us, all of his creation, to be one with him in the kingdom of heaven. That's what it means to get to heaven. Not just to be one with God, but to be one with each other.